I stared at the screen, stunned. My mom saw my face and immediately asked, "What's wrong?" But I couldn't even speak. It was one thing for my dad to be cold or distant. He'd been that way my whole life. But this, on the biggest day of my life, that felt like a punch to the gut. And here's the kicker. This wasn't the first time he pulled something like this. Not even close. My dad has been blaming me for ruining his life since before I was born. He said I broke up his first marriage. Yeah, apparently, my existence was such a cosmic disaster that it destroyed a relationship that had already ended before my mom even got pregnant. Make it make sense. Growing up, I didn't just feel like an afterthought to him. I felt like an accident he had to deal with. Everything I did was wrong, and every time something went wrong in his life, I was the scapegoat. But today, I thought it would be different. I mean, it's my wedding day. How petty could he really be? Turns out, the answer is very petty. Let me rewind a bit. A month ago, I actually tried to do the whole make peace thing. I called him and asked if he would walk me down the aisle. I wasn't sure how he'd react, but I thought, hey, maybe this is the olive branch we need. At first, he sounded okay. He said he'd think about it. And I let myself hope for just a second that this could be the start of something better. But then, the next day, he sent me an email. Not a call. Not even a text. An email. In it, he basically told me my wedding was a waste of time and money, and he couldn't justify being there when he had real obligations to Emma, my older half-sister. Emma, the golden child. She's his daughter from his first marriage, and she's perfect. Perfect grades, perfect looks, perfect life. He's always had her on this pedestal, and I've been in her shadow for as long as I can remember. Growing up, I wanted to be like her so badly, but no matter what I did, I couldn't measure up. My dad made sure I knew it too. If Emma got an A, my B+ wasn't good enough. If Emma won an award, my efforts were bare minimum. I stopped trying to impress him years ago, but the favoritism still stung. Back to the email. The part that really got me wasn't even the excuses. It was when he wrote, "You know, Emma would never waste money like this. You should take a page from her book." Yeah, because that's what every bride wants to hear a month before her wedding. I tried to brush it off and focus on the people who actually cared about me. My mom, my fiancé Jake, my friends. But it was like my dad's voice was stuck in my head. He'd pulled this crap so many times before, and I should have been used to it. But I wasn't. Then, a week before the wedding, Emma called me. At first, I thought she was calling to wish me luck or say something supportive. But no. She called to tell me she'd just gotten back from their dad-daughter trip to Hawaii. Apparently, my dad had taken her and her fiancé on a surprise vacation as a pre-wedding gift. She sounded guilty as hell while she told me, like she knew how messed up it was, but that didn't make it hurt any less. The whole time, I was thinking, so he can fly across the world for her, but he can't even show up for me? When I told Jake about the call, he was livid. "He's not coming," Jake said firmly. "Don't give him the satisfaction of ruining your day." But the thing is, I didn't even want him there anymore. I just wanted to understand why I was never enough for him. Why he treated me like a burden while Emma got the red carpet. But then came the text. On the morning of my wedding, while I was literally getting ready to walk down the aisle, he sent that final little dagger. My money's better spent on my real daughter. I stared at that text for what felt like forever. My bridesmaids were laughing and chatting, oblivious to the fact that I was 2 seconds away from losing it. I felt this rush of emotions, anger, sadness, frustration, and then just numbness. What was I supposed to do? Cry over him and ruin my makeup? Call him back and beg him to change his mind? No, not this time. I shoved my phone in my bag and told myself to let it go. But letting it go was easier said than done. While my makeup artist was fixing up my hair, all I could think about was how this wasn't some one-off thing. My dad had spent my entire life making me feel like I didn't matter. I thought back to when I was a kid, begging him to come to my soccer games. He always said he was busy, but somehow, he'd find time to drive Emma to her ballet recitals. Or how, on my 10th birthday, he showed up 2 hours late and spent the whole time on the phone. It was like being his daughter was an inconvenience he had to endure. Still, for years, I held on to this fantasy that one day, he'd change. That maybe he'd see me as more than just his mistake. Even in my 20s, when I was completely independent and barely spoke to him, I still had this stupid little hope that he'd wake up and realize what he'd missed out on. That text shattered whatever was left of that hope. It was like he was saying, "I've made my choice, and it's not you." The ceremony was beautiful, by the way. My mom walked me down the aisle, and Jake's face lit up the second he saw me. For a while, I forgot about the text and just focused on the moment. We laughed, we cried, and we danced until our feet hurt. But every time someone asked about my dad, where he was, why he wasn't there, it brought the sting back. I ended up telling people he had a last-minute emergency, which felt pathetic. But what else was I supposed to say? Oh, he doesn't think I'm worth his time? The day after the wedding, Jake and I were packing up when my mom came into the room holding her phone. She looked furious. Apparently, my dad had posted on Facebook about the wedding. Not mine, Emma's. He shared this long, glowing post about how proud he was to see his little girl start the next chapter of her life, complete with photos of her and her fiancé on the beach in Hawaii. He didn't even mention my wedding. Not once. That was the moment I decided I was done. No more trying to fix things. No more leaving the door open. I blocked his number, unfriended him on social media, and told my mom I didn't want to hear about him anymore. She looked sad, but she didn't argue. I think even she was starting to realize that this wasn't just a rough patch. It was who he was. For a while, I thought cutting him off would give me closure, but it didn't. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out what I'd done to make him hate me so much. I knew, logically, that it wasn't my fault, but that didn't stop the questions. Was it because I wasn't as talented as Emma? Because I wasn't his firstborn? Because I reminded him of my mom? None of it made sense, but the need to understand wouldn't go away. A few months later, I found out something that added a whole new layer to the mess. My mom and I were going through some old boxes, and I came across a stack of letters. They were from my dad to my mom, written before I was born. Most of them were just the usual stuff, talking about work, making plans, that kind of thing, but one letter stood out. In it, he wrote about how he was afraid to have another kid. He said he didn't think he'd ever love anyone the way he loved Emma, and he worried that having a second child would take away from the bond they had. That hit me like a ton of bricks. He'd made up his mind about me before I even existed. I never had a chance. No matter what I did, I was always going to be the kid he didn't want. For a long time, I thought there was something wrong with me, that I wasn't good enough, smart enough, or lovable enough. But reading that letter made me realize it wasn't about me at all. It was about him and his own issues. After that, I decided to see a therapist. I didn't tell anyone at first, not even Jake. I felt embarrassed, like admitting I needed help was some kind of weakness. But those sessions ended up being the best thing I ever did for myself. For the first time, I had someone who helped me untangle all the guilt and anger I'd been carrying around for years. One of the things my therapist said stuck with me. You don't have to keep toxic people in your life just because they're family. It sounds obvious, but it was something I needed to hear. For so long, I felt obligated to keep reaching out to my dad, to keep giving him chances, because he was my dad. But why? Why should I keep hurting myself just to make him comfortable? Eventually, I told Jake about the therapy, and he was nothing but supportive. He even offered to come to a session with me if I ever wanted him to. Having him in my corner made all the difference. Cutting my dad out of my life was supposed to be the end of it. But of course, it wasn't that simple. A few months after the wedding, Emma called me. It wasn't a casual, "Hey, how are you doing?" kind of call. She sounded serious, and right off the bat, she asked if I had a minute to talk about Dad. That alone irritated me. She knew I'd cut him off, and I didn't want to get dragged back into anything. But curiosity got the better of me, so I said, "Sure, what's going on?" She told me Dad had been talking about me a lot recently. Not to me, of course, but to her and some of his friends. According to Emma, he'd been saying things like, "I don't know what I did to deserve this," and "She just cut me out of her life without even giving me a chance." Hearing that made my blood boil. The man who didn't even bother showing up for my wedding, who spent my whole life treating me like an afterthought, was now playing the victim? Emma must have sensed my frustration because she immediately followed up with, "I'm not saying he's right, but he seems, I don't know, sad." That was classic Emma, always trying to smooth things over. She'd been the peacekeeper in our family for as long as I could remember, and it drove me crazy. I told her I wasn't interested in hearing about Dad's feelings, and she started to argue, saying that maybe I should talk to him and try to work things out. That was when I snapped. I told her everything. About the text he sent me on my wedding day, about the email, about the years of favoritism and neglect. I laid it all out, no sugarcoating. By the time I was done, she was quiet. For a second, I thought maybe she'd finally get it. But instead, she said, "I don't think it's as black and white as you're making it out to be. He's not perfect, but he loves both of us in his own way." That was the last straw for me. I told her if she wanted to keep defending him, that was her choice. But I was done. Then I hung up. For the next few weeks, I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. I focused on work, on Jake, on anything that didn't involve my dad or Emma. But then, out of nowhere, I got a letter in the mail. It was from my dad. I didn't even want to open it at first. I figured it would just be more of the same. Excuses, guilt trips, and empty apologies. But eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. The letter was surprisingly short, just a few paragraphs. In it, he said he was sorry for not coming to the wedding and for the things he said. He didn't really explain why he'd done those things, but he said he regretted them. There was one line that stood out to me. "I know I've failed you in a lot of ways, but I hope we can start fresh." It was the first time I'd ever seen him admit to any kind of failure, and for a moment, I thought maybe he was serious about changing. I showed the letter to my therapist during our next session, and we spent most of the hour talking about what I wanted to do. She reminded me that I didn't owe him anything, but she also said it was okay to give him another chance if I thought it would bring me peace. I spent the next few days going back and forth, trying to decide if I should respond. In the end, I decided to write back. I kept it short and to the point. I told him I appreciated the apology, but I needed more than just words. If he wanted a fresh start, he'd have to show me he was serious. He called me a week later. The conversation was awkward at first. He apologized again, but it felt rehearsed, like he was reading from a script. I told him I needed him to be honest with me. No excuses, no deflections. I wanted to know why he treated me the way he did for so many years. That's when he dropped a bombshell. He told me he'd been struggling with depression for most of his life, and that it got worse after his first marriage ended. He said he was angry and bitter, and instead of dealing with those feelings, he took them out on me and my mom. He said it wasn't fair, and he regretted it, but he didn't know how to make it right. I didn't know what to say. On one hand, it was the closest thing to an explanation I'd ever gotten. On the other hand, it felt like he was trying to use his depression as an excuse for years of neglect. I told him I appreciated his honesty, but I needed time to process everything. After that call, I decided to take a break from therapy for a while. I needed to figure things out on my own. I wasn't sure if I could ever fully forgive my dad, but part of me wanted to try. Not for him, but for me. A few weeks later, I got another call from Emma. She told me Dad had been seeing a therapist and trying to work through his issues. She seemed hopeful, like maybe this was the start of something better. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't help feeling skeptical. People don't just change overnight, especially not someone like my dad. Still, I agreed to meet him for coffee. It was the first time we'd seen each other in over a year, and it was strange. He seemed nervous, which was so unlike him. He talked about his therapy sessions and some of the things he'd been working on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was just saying what he thought I wanted to hear. When the conversation turned to Emma, though, he slipped back into his old habits. He started gushing about her wedding and how proud he was of her. He even showed me pictures from their trip to Hawaii. It felt like he hadn't learned anything at all. That was when I realized something important. I didn't need him to change. I didn't need his approval or his love. I just needed to let go of the idea that he was ever going to be the dad I wanted him to be. After that coffee meeting, I thought I'd made peace with my decision to move on from my dad, but it turns out it wasn't that simple. Cutting someone out of your life, even when it feels like the right thing to do, leaves this weird gap. It's not just about losing them. It's about losing the idea of what they were supposed to be. I didn't just lose my dad. I lost the chance at having the kind of relationship I used to dream about. For a few months, things were quiet. My dad stopped reaching out, and I kept my distance. Emma would call every now and then to check in, but we both avoided talking about him. It felt like we were all tiptoeing around this huge, unresolved mess. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from one of my cousins on Facebook. "Hey, are you coming to the family reunion next month? Your dad said he invited you, but I wasn't sure if you'd be there." I had no idea what she was talking about. My dad hadn't mentioned anything about a reunion, let alone invited me to one. I asked her for details, and she sent me the flyer. It was some big family gathering at a park a couple of hours away, with my dad listed as one of the organizers. I was so annoyed. Not only had he failed to invite me, but he'd apparently told everyone I was coming. I debated whether or not to confront him about it. Part of me felt like it wasn't worth the effort, but another part of me was just tired of him getting away with things like this. I ended up calling him, and as soon as he picked up, I asked, "Why are you telling people I'm coming to this reunion when you didn't even bother inviting me?" He sounded flustered, like he hadn't expected me to find out. He stammered something about assuming I wouldn't want to come but wanting to leave the door open. That made no sense. If he wanted me to come, why not just tell me about it? I told him I wasn't going, and he got defensive. He started saying things like, "I can't win with you, can I?" And "You're always looking for a reason to be mad at me." That conversation was the nail in the coffin for me. I realized he wasn't interested in fixing our relationship. He just wanted to control the narrative. He wanted to be able to tell everyone he'd done his part, so he could paint me as the difficult one. I hung up on him and decided, once and for all, that I was done. But the drama wasn't over yet. A week before the reunion, Emma called me again. She said she'd been talking to Dad, and he was upset that I wasn't coming. Apparently, he'd told her I was making him look bad by refusing to show up. I told her the same thing I told him. If he wanted me there, he should have invited me himself instead of expecting me to find out through someone else. Emma tried to play mediator, as usual. She said things like, "I know he's not perfect, but he's trying, and maybe this is his way of reaching out." I told her I wasn't interested in guessing games. If he wanted to reach out, he could do it directly. She didn't push any further, but I could tell she was disappointed. The day of the reunion, I thought about blocking my dad's number, just to avoid any drama, but I didn't. Sure enough, he texted me that evening. "Everyone's asking where you are." I told them you were too busy to come. That made me so angry, I couldn't stop myself from responding. "You didn't invite me. If you wanted me there, you should have said so instead of lying to everyone about it." He didn't reply. That night, I talked to Jake about everything, and he said something that really stuck with me. "You can't keep waiting for him to act like the dad you deserve. He's not going to change. The only thing you can do is decide how much space you want to give him in your life." That hit hard because I knew he was right. I'd spent so much time waiting for my dad to be someone he wasn't, and all it had done was hurt me. I decided then and there that I was done giving him power over my emotions. The next morning, I sent him a message. I told him I was tired of the lies, the manipulation, and the constant guilt trips. I said I didn't want to cut him out completely, but I needed some serious boundaries if we were ever going to have any kind of relationship. I told him he needed to respect those boundaries, or I'd have no choice but to walk away for good. He didn't respond right away, and I honestly didn't expect him to. But a few days later, he sent me a long email. In it, he apologized, not just for the reunion, but for everything. He admitted he'd been selfish and unfair, and he said he wanted to do better. I didn't know how to feel. On one hand, it was the apology I'd been waiting for my entire life. On the other hand, I wasn't sure if I could trust it. I told him I appreciated his words, but I needed to see action before I could believe anything had changed. Over the next few months, he made an effort. He called me every couple of weeks, just to check in, and he actually listened when I told him about my life. He even apologized to Jake for the way he'd acted before the wedding. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Still, I kept my guard up. I wasn't ready to forgive him completely, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. But for the first time, I felt like I was in control of the relationship instead of letting him dictate everything. A few months after my dad started making an effort, I thought things might actually be improving. He seemed more consistent, more willing to reach out without expecting something in return, and less focused on comparing me to Emma. I wasn't sure if this was genuine growth or just another phase. but I figured it was worth giving him the chance to prove himself. Things took a turn, though, when Emma announced she was pregnant. She and her husband had been trying for a while, and my dad was over the moon. He called me to share the news, even though I'd already heard it from Emma. At first, I thought it was sweet that he wanted to include me, but the conversation quickly shifted into familiar territory. "She's going to be such an amazing mom," he said, his voice brimming with pride. "I can't wait to help out however I can. I've already told her I'll pay for anything she needs, nursery furniture, baby clothes, whatever." I congratulated him, but I couldn't help feeling a pang of frustration. It wasn't about Emma. I was genuinely happy for her. But hearing him talk about how much he was planning to do for her brought back all the old feelings of being left out. I thought about how he'd skipped out on birthdays, forgotten milestones, and barely acknowledged my wedding. Now he was falling over himself to be involved in Emma's child's life before the baby was even born. Over the next few weeks, my dad called less frequently. When he did, most of the conversation revolved around Emma and her pregnancy. He talked about the ultrasounds, the baby shower they were planning, and how excited he was to be a grandfather. I tried to be supportive and engage in the conversations, but it felt like I was fading into the background again. Then, one day, I got a call from Emma. She told me my dad had offered to buy her a new car to make it easier for her to get around with the baby. She sounded a little embarrassed, like she knew it was excessive, but she didn't seem inclined to turn it down. I told her I was happy for her, but after we hung up, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I thought back to when I was in college, struggling to keep up with tuition and rent. I'd asked my dad for a little help, just enough to cover a few months' worth of expenses, and he'd said no. He told me I needed to learn how to be independent and figure things out on my own. Now, years later, he was buying Emma a car without a second thought. That night, I talked to Jake about everything. He reminded me that my dad's actions weren't a reflection of my worth, but that didn't make it hurt any less. I tried to focus on the progress we'd made in our relationship, but it was hard not to feel like I was being pushed aside again. The breaking point came a few weeks later, when I invited my dad over for dinner. I wanted to reconnect, to spend some time together that didn't revolve around Emma or her baby. He agreed, and I spent the whole day cooking and getting everything ready. But an hour before he was supposed to arrive, he called to cancel. "I'm so sorry," he said. "Emma's not feeling well, and I want to make sure she's okay. Rain check?" I told him it was fine, but after I hung up, I felt this overwhelming wave of disappointment. It wasn't just about the dinner. It was about everything. Every time I tried to reach out, every time I tried to let him back into my life, it felt like he found a way to let me down. The next day, I wrote him a letter. I told him how I felt, how his actions had hurt me over the years, and how I needed more from him if we were going to have a real relationship. I didn't hold back, but I also didn't attack him. I just laid it all out, as honestly and clearly as I could. Then I mailed it and waited. It took him 2 weeks to respond. When he finally called, his tone was different. He didn't sound defensive or dismissive. He sounded sad. He apologized for canceling dinner and admitted he hadn't realized how much his actions were affecting me. He said he wanted to do better, but he didn't know where to start. I told him it wasn't about grand gestures or big apologies. I just wanted him to show up, to be consistent, to make an effort, and to treat me like I mattered. He said he understood, and for the first time, I felt like he was really listening. Things didn't change overnight, but they did start to get better. He called more often, not just to talk about Emma, but to ask about me and my life. He made an effort to be present, even in small ways. It wasn't perfect, and I knew it never would be, but it was a step in the right direction. The real turning point came when Emma had her baby. My dad was, of course, over the moon, but he didn't let it overshadow his relationship with me. He made a point to include me in family gatherings, and even invited Jake and me to visit the baby with him. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. Over time, I learned to let go of the resentment I'd been holding onto for so long. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen all at once, but I realized that holding onto that anger was only hurting me. I still kept my boundaries in place, and I didn't let my dad off the hook for his past behavior, but I stopped letting it define our relationship. Looking back, I don't think my dad will ever fully understand the impact his actions had on me. But I've come to terms with the fact that I can't change him. I can only control how I respond. And for now, that's enough.